Lee Perry's time at Studio One in the first part of the 1960s had shown him capable of writing hit songs for others, of recording his own, either in a moralistic vein, as on his first released song, Bad-Minded People, as invitations to dance, as on Chicken Scratch, which gave him his enduring nickname of Scratch, and also showed some of his more peculiar predilections on risque and ribald tunes like Roast Duck and Dr. Dick, and he had also shown a facility for recognizing and developing other talents around him, but he was not getting the rewards he felt he deserved for all his work over 5 years. So by 1966, as the beat of ska slowed down to rocksteady, he made the decision to strike out on his own and leave Studio One. The next couple of years would see him develop his own identity to discover what he had to contribute within the field of music. This is the second chapter of my look at Lee Scratch Perry through some of the records from my collection. Thanks for joining me. One of the first songs Lee Perry recorded away from Studio One in 1966, still in the ska style, was Give Me Justice for producer Carl Johnson, aka Sir JJ. On this song, Perry let loose his frustration, his anger, his resentment at his former employer for not giving him the rewards he felt he was owed after his years of work. As he says, "I won't crawl on my knees for what's owed to me. Why do you have to heap oppression on the innocent ones?" This saw him not only expressing his own personal grievance, but in a larger sense, aligning himself with the sufferers, the everyday people, struggling to get by day, while they look at those profiting off their labors and not sharing in the rewards. In the meantime, Lee Perry had a fire to prove himself in the music field. He had ideas he wanted to express. What he didn't have was a lot of money to book studio time, to book musicians, without the backing of his former employer. One of his first moves in 1967 was to link up with an old acquaintance, another former employee of Cox and Dodds, who'd filled much the same role Lee Perry had done after him, Prince Buster, who was then an independent producer of his own. Lee Perry respected Prince Buster. There must have been no hard feelings between the two of them for all the lyrical shots Lee Perry had fired at Prince Buster in his days at Studio One on songs like The Prince and the Duke or Spit in the Sky, written for Delroy Wilson, all of which took a lyrical aim straight at the head of Prince Buster. The two of them formed kind of a loose partnership with Lee Perry contributing lyrics and some vocals to some classic Prince Buster sides of the time, including Judge Dredd, in which was a kind of a spoken word courtroom drama, seeing Prince Buster assume the role of Judge Dredd, passing sentence on the rude boys of before him in the court. This was the era of the rude boys, ratchet knife-wielding youths who were then tearing up dances, terrorizing Kingston, Jamaica. Had Lee Perry contributing to those songs, also to Ghost Dance, which took another look at the rude boys and their fight against society, fight against the law, and its inevitable violent consequences. By 1967, however, later in 1967, Prince Buster had left for the UK to go on tour. Lee Perry was left to his own devices. He went off to WIRL Studios, West Indies Records Limited, and became something of an in-house arranger there, working for them, doing the actual hands-on producing, arranging songs, bringing in new talent, and occasionally he would get the chance to do some of his own recordings, partly in payment for his services. A couple of these were Set Them Free, and Don't Blame the Children. These are continuing the theme begun by Prince Buster on Judge Dredd with this kind of spoken word courtroom drama, but Lee Perry taking a different stance than the severe sentences handed out by Judge Dredd, as he takes more of a measured look at Black history, the legacy of colonialism, and shows lenience toward the Rude Boys, as he says, "But as you can see, they're from a poor generation, having no education, no qualification, so they're driven to desperation." So he proposes leniency for the Rude Boys as victims, in a sense, of the legacies of history. However, his time at WIRL would be short-lived the first time around, as he was replaced at in-house producer by another up-and-coming young producer named Bunny Lee. The two of them would be friends. They would have something of a tempestuous on-again, off-again relationship. Best of friends one week, quarreling and taking lyrical pot shots on their records at each other the next. Lee Perry's next move was to go over to another young up-and-coming producer by the name of Joel Gibson, aka Joe Gibbs, who was then just getting started as a producer himself. Again, Lee Perry took the same role of in-house producer, arranger, again, not credited at the time, but he was the one in the studio doing the actual arranging of the music, doing the actual hands-on producing of the songs, while Joe Gibbs is financing the sessions, putting the finished results out on his own labels. This is the typical Jamaican setup of the time. When Lee Perry graduated to becoming a producer of his own, he would be something of an exception in that he would be more of a hands-on producer himself, having already got all this experience working for others. For Joe Gibbs, he would record Stranger and Gladdy, Stranger Cole and Gladstone Anderson, the pianist. Stranger Cole had been the one who had recorded one of Lee Perry's very first songs, causing an altercation between Lee Perry and Duke Reed. Lee Perry must have had no hard feelings towards Stranger Cole, as he recorded them at Joe Gibbs. Some of Lee Perry's work for Joe Gibbs is contained on this Trojan compilation. The Reggae Train, Joe Gibbs and Friends, appeared on Trojan Records in the late 1980s. He would also work with a vocal group called the Pioneers for Joe Gibbs, produce some of their songs. Greetings from the Pioneers, their debut album released in the UK on Joe Gibbs's amalgamated imprint, contains Lee Perry productions. He would work with a vocal group called the Versatiles, which contained a singer named Junior Biles, later to be known as Junior Biles, who would work extensively with Lee Perry, also with many other artists, the Slickers, Ken Parker, many other artists for Lee Perry, and for Joe Gibbs, sorry. And while at Joe Gibbs' studio, Lee Perry decided the time was right. He was settled enough to take yet another lyrical pot shot at his former employer, Cox and Dodd. By this time, the rhythms of ska with the driving horn sections, the chugging rhythms, had slowed down. They had changed the beat up. The guitar and the organ had assumed a more prominent role as rhythm instruments, and while the horn sections had moved more to a supporting role, more of a background role, this allowed more space in the music for vocalists to come forth, heavily inspired by the US soul model of groups like the Impressions. And you saw in this period, between 1966 to 1968, a plethora of talented vocal acts, of talented singers emerge in Jamaica. This was the era of rocksteady, the slower, more sinuous beat of rocksteady. Lee Perry was then at Joe Gibbs' studio, and he issued a song with a potent lyrical message aimed at his former employer, Cox and Dodd, but now in the rocksteady style. The song was called The Upsetter, giving him yet another of his lyrical nicknames, and not merely a nickname. This assumed something of an alternative persona for Lee Perry, giving him the freedom to play around with different identities, both on record and off. The Upsetter by Lee Perry. featured a sinuous guitar line by Nearlin Lynn Tate, one of the prime architects, the guitarist Lynn Tate, one of the prime architects of the slower rocksteady beat, as well as Gladstone Anderson and many others. These are some of the top musicians of the moment who often recorded under the name the All-Stars or under different names according to whatever producer they were working for. Gladstone Anderson would be there, Jackie Jackson, Hux Brown, Lynn Tate on guitar. The Upsetter, I am the Upsetter, he declared on this record. Why you so gravelicious? You want everything for yourself. But this saw the anger, the resentment of Give Me Justice mutated somewhat into a more defiant stance. As he says, I'm going to give you a right and a left and an uppercut. He's now come into his own, Lee Perry has, and found his identity as the Upsetter. Perry's hit song, The Upsetter, for Joe Gibbs, saw him assume a new musical identity and realized his destiny was to upset, to shake up the apple cart, to disturb the status quo. He wasn't interested in being the big dog or being aligned with them. He wanted to be the underdog, taking aim at them, and the stubbornly independent stance would stick with him for the rest of his career. Further songs for Joe Gibbs, like Kimball, would see him show, maybe for the first time on record, his love of TV, film, pop culture. Here as he pays homage to the Fugitive TV series of the 1960s, throwing in sound effects of breaking glass and cracking whips as he creates a sense of drama and excitement within the confines of a 2 or 3 minute 45 RPM record. But he would soon run into the same issues with Joe Gibbs that he had previously had with Cox and Dodd, not feeling adequately remunerated for his work, for all the hit songs he had given Joe Gibbs, allowing to elevate his status as a producer through all the hit songs that Lee Perry was actually producing for him. After a confrontation between the two one night, Lee Perry would leave Joe Gibbs's employ. His next moves would be to align himself with various other up-and-coming producers like Clancy Eccles. He would also begin associating with the innovative studio engineer Linford Anderson, aka Andy Capp, after the comic strip character. Anderson was an engineer at WIRL Studios, where Lee Perry had previously worked, who had come up with a song called Pop-A-Top, where he reworked an old Canada Dry soft drink commercial. One night, Anderson and Lee Perry were out drinking. They were making their way home through the streets of Kingston when Lee Perry overheard the sounds of a Pocomania service going on. Pocomania was an African spirit religion which had been transplanted to Jamaica from Africa, had become somewhat fused with various strains of Christian tradition, but at its heart was an African spirit belief system where participants would go into heights of ecstasy and be transported as the spirits would move them. And Lee Perry was transfixed by the sound of these wailing voices reaching the heights of spiritual ecstasy. Struck something in him, resonated a chord maybe that made him remember his youth growing up in rural Jamaica, the services he would have attended, and gave him the idea for a new song that would be yet another potshot at his former employer, this time Joe Gibbs. The next night, he repaired to WIRL Studios with Linford Anderson at the controls. Musicians present included Hux Brown on guitar, Jackie Jackson on bass, Gladstone Anderson on piano, as Lee Perry recorded a song called People Funny Boy, taking yet another grudgeful shot at a former employer. As an added touch to drive the point home, Linford Anderson added sound effects of unearthly wailing babies to create a sense of unease, of disturbance that really hit home Lee Perry's new persona as the Upsetter. The song was a massive hit and signaled a shift to a new rhythm. It was one of a handful of songs which were beginning to change the beat of Jamaican music from the sinuous rocksteady rhythm, which had prevailed from 1966. It was now 1968. Things were starting to speed up. The rhythm was starting to change a little bit. And songs like People Funny Boy, Lee Scratch Perry, and Feel the Rhythm by Clancy Eccles, which Lee Perry had had some involvement in, were changing the sound of Jamaican music to a style that would come to be known as reggae. Didn't have a name yet. Was still appearing on compilations like Rocksteady Intensified here on WIRL Records. The WIRL label itself, very early thrift store find for me here. Rocksteady Intensified, but actually signaling the shift to reggae. Joe Gibbs would respond to that song. People Funny Boy was a major hit for Lee Perry, the upsetter. He would respond with People Grudgeful, credited to Sir Gibbs, reportedly Gibbs himself in a rare appearance on record, but there was no stopping the upsetter at this point. His destiny was set and the sky was the limit. Join me in chapter 3 of my look at Lee Perry.